welcome back as we continue through the week, moving into chapter 2 of the book of Exodus here. And really, I mean, this is where we pick up the story that most of us know of the Exodus, which is the story of Moses. The first chapter serves as backdrop to set the stage for Moses' birth and why it is that Moses is born and hidden and raised the way that he is. But it also sets the backdrop for the slavery of the people, the treatment of the people, and their situation. So let's move into this. I'm going to read a few verses here, and then we'll try to expound on them a little bit. So there was a man from the house of Levi who went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a child, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it, and she placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. We can stop there probably, Michael. Israelite women, men, a Levite from the tribe of Levi. She has a baby. It's a boy. We ended yesterday with the knowledge that the Pharaoh has now given a decree to all the people that whenever they see an infant son, a male infant among the Hebrews, they are to throw him in the river. And so here she does what most mothers, she hides him as long as she can. And when she could no longer hide him, she gets a basket and ironically puts him in the river, on the bank of the river among the reeds, and then sends his sister, we get the sense in the next part that she was sent, but regardless, the sister stands at a distance to sort of keep an eye out and watch over her younger brother. So, Michael, I'm sure this is the kind of thing that may have been happening. We don't know if this is a common event, but certainly there were parents trying to find their way to protect their children, to keep them from this monstrous thing that the Pharaoh has decreed and that evidently the people are doing. And that sets the backdrop for how it is that Moses is going to be born and how he's going to be named and how he's going to make his way into the Pharaoh's house.
If you remember your high school English literature classes, I suspect that at some point you went through the beginnings of stories, introduction, the importance of how you introduce a character in the context. And we've had a lot of the backstory told in the first chapter. Now that we've turned to chapter 2, there is a kind of pace that we've now hit as we introduce Moses, who is going to be this very heroic type figure. And I think when I use heroic there, I'm meaning it in the more literature sense, because there's some really interesting elements that you might miss if you don't take the time to see them. Look, for instance, at the fact that his parents in verse 1 are not named. They go nameless, though we had the midwives' names, so it's not as if the author has been unwilling to name people. But here, they're left nameless, much like in literature when you have a hero being born. You'll have this where the parents conceive, but they aren't named. They will later be named in the story, interestingly, but not here. Note that it says that they're from the house of Levi, which at this point in the story is not as significant as what it will be later on, when the lineage of being from Levi and therefore coming from a priestly tradition or background is significant and a part of Moses' ability. That gets named right off of the start here in the text. So right away, these details, they may pass by us if we don't slow enough to see them. But here we have the beginning of the story of an extraordinary person, someone who, of course, God is going to use in substantial ways. And it's not that the parents aren't important. I mean, clearly, they've named that his mother not only conceives, but she has the bravery to keep him, to hold him, to care for him for 3 months in the midst of him ostensibly being sought out by the deputized population. And so obviously it's important, and her faith sticks out here. But there's also clearly a sense in the text already that in his Levitical heritage, Moses has some credentialing. In his parents not being named, there's a sense that this is the telling of a story of someone who's going to be significant. There's a lot of sort of small details that add up here to a bigger point.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, Michael, as we continue here and we get into some of those details. Let's circle back to some of them. Let's pick this up in verse 5. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds. She sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying. She took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her own. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him from the water. So, very interesting. One of the conjectures about this text is that this is a setup, that the daughter's waiting, that they knew the Pharaoh's daughter was coming or would be by, that this is a deliberate attempt to try and find a person of influence, to find this boy. And I don't know, it'd be hard to say one way or another on that. The Bible does sort of, as a Middle Eastern document, kind of rewards shrewdness, or it likes the idea of plans coming together sometimes. But here we have this, we have this connection. This young girl says, hey, I know a woman who's nursing, and obviously there would have been many if the male children are being taken, then they would have had many women who were probably not raising children that they had delivered. So this doesn't seem strange. And the Pharaoh's daughter said yes. And so Moses actually gets to go back to his home. He gets to grow up there to some age. And it's not clear if this is when he's weaned, perhaps, maybe most likely, possibly older. But at that point, then the parents have to take Moses back to the Pharaoh's daughter. And interestingly enough, she names him. And the word Moses traditionally is translated to be drawn up or brought up. It also is very similar. That's the Hebrew version. It's very similar in Egypt to the word son. And I wonder, Michael, if part of why this lineage has been lost is that Moses doesn't get the traditional naming of a male child. You would kind of think that the Bible would have maybe known, but it may have been very difficult for Moses, who may not have remembered his parents or this story. I don't know. It's interesting to wonder about the unnamed parents and why it is maybe that we don't know their names in this story, but I wonder if it has something to do with the way that his own name is given to him.
There are some really interesting details that actually the early church picked up as well. And I definitely don't want you to miss this. When we come into this part of the text about this basket, what you might not know here in verse 5, when the daughter of Pharaoh, who, by the way, also is not named, which is worth noting, that fundamentally all of the power players in this are all of the people who are taking action are not named. And it's only later that we even find out Moses' sister's name. That comes later in the story as well. But that's not the point. The point here is when you see in verse 5 the basket, that's the exact same word as the ark used in the Noah stories. And this is a very compelling idea that this little thing, this rudderless object, is going to be the thing that God is going to direct and use to bring deliverance, to bring freedom, to bring new life on the other side of a really bad situation. And what is striking here is somewhat knowing the specialness of this moment. The Pharaoh's daughter names Moses as the one drawn out, right? And like you said, Clint, there's this detachment from the lineage. There's a detachment from the life he would have lived otherwise. And on one hand, she would have thought of that as the child that she pulled out of the water. She rescued. She would have attributed that to her action pulling Moses out. But from a Hebrew perspective, Moses in that moment has been lifted out by God's providential love and care. God has used the Pharaoh's daughter to essentially save the one who will be made a vessel of God's deliverance for the people. And so the people oppressed might actually see the very name given by this woman to be a sign or symbol of a larger providential act of God. It's details like this that aren't accidental, Clint. I mean, it's a layered story on purpose, and we're supposed to see all of those layers. And I guess I didn't get to. The early church saw in the being drawn out metaphor also an image of Jesus Christ, that ultimately he was fully God, fully human, that he would be the chosen one that would be drawn out and would be the one who would provide the path for salvation for others.
Yeah, I think there's two things that are of interest to me, or two things that I would want to include, Michael. And the first is that it's I think it's really good storytelling that the water here for the Hebrew people represents danger, and yet it is also the mechanism by which Moses is delivered. So it is that the children are to go into the river as their death sentence, and yet then he is drawn out by the Pharaoh's daughter, potentially through the planning and wisdom of his own mother and sister. And that leads to the second point, I would say. We don't know anything about this daughter of Pharaoh. It could be that she's simply spoiled, but for whatever reason, she acts to preserve life. She finds a 3-month-old child. She disregards at some level her father's directive and instead takes this child. She does so from a place of privilege, probably a place of some power, some authority. No one is likely to argue with her except her father, who doesn't seem to, for whatever reason. But it is interesting, Michael, that so far in this first verse and a half, or chapter and a half in Exodus, every female character we've seen works toward preserving life. The midwives, Moses' mother, his sister, now the daughter of the Pharaoh. We have much to be said of the active role of women in this first part of the story, who are at their own risk in some cases, seeking to do what saves children, what preserves life. And I don't know I don't know that how intentional that is in the story, but I think, that we've talked in Genesis, the Bible as a product of its time and its culture doesn't always celebrate women the way that we wish that it did. But I think a case could be made in this chapter and a half that every female character we see is to be applauded and commended.
Yeah, one thing worth noting here is so much of our Genesis conversation, if you were with us for that, was about the idea of barrenness for women and the idea that God would be faithful and provide even in the midst of not being able to have children and therefore not being able to carry on the lineage. That's very different here in Exodus, where in some ways the table has turned. Here, the Hebrew women are having so much success in carrying their children. They're so virulent that they're ultimately a threat to Pharaoh. And so the fact that here, once again, the story is pushed forward, and in this case by deeply courageous women, and by women whose blessing has extended and made them able to not only have this child, but have the courage to protect that child. And then maybe to your point, Clint, the willingness, the providential need to pull this child out of the water and to save it is an action that by no means should be expected for this princess. I mean, there's a sense in which we should be surprised by it. And here we find that God is able to make a way because of people's faithfulness, because of people's courage, because of their willingness to listen and to trust. And in the midst of it, God is working this substantial kind of figure for the sake of ultimately freeing God's people. And I just think it's striking here when you look at the end of this section, verse 10. I drew him out of the water. We're going to see so much more drawing out in the rest of this story in so many literal and figurative ways. A play on the water, a play on who's the one who has the authority and ability to save and to pull out. This is almost like in naming Moses and in sensing this moment, this non-Israelite has somehow intuited and spoken almost the thread that will go over the whole. And if we're attentive to it, I think it'll stick out as we go.
Yeah, we'll cover a lot of ground tomorrow. This chapter moves through Moses' story fairly quickly in order to get us on to the primary task of this book, of this story. But join us tomorrow if you can. We'll see the next step in Moses' growth.
Thanks for being with us, everyone.